Okay, good evening. This is Meta Spencer in Toronto, and I want to invite you to a very interesting evening. We're going to save the world together, you and I, and a few other people, like 10 or 12 other people, will be speaking to you about the parts of the world that they're going to save. I kind of think that I don't like it when people mock other people for, saying, oh, he's going to save the world. Well, I think we really have to take seriously the idea that we do have to save the world, and maybe some part of it anyway. So that's what we're about tonight. I think that there are about 6 global threats that really face humankind with very serious consequences and that we need to deal with. And for the most part, there are experts and there are NGOs working in these areas, and but they kind of work in silos. They don't necessarily have much contact with each other. But the thing that occurs to me is that many of these global threats actually are interconnected. And the 6 that I think we should be worrying about are war and weapons, and of course, especially nuclear weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, massive radiation exposure from something like a reactor explosion, and nowadays the new one is cyber attacks. And we do have people working on these issues, and yet I think we would make a lot more progress if we worked a little bit more together, not necessarily organizationally, but I think that our platforms, our proposals, our agendas are very compatible. So what we want to do is look at the different ways in which we have proposals for public policy, proposals that should be considered as kind of a package. So what we want to put together is a list of the best kinds of proposals that people can come up with in terms of public policy innovations that, if they were adopted, would make a real difference in the reducing the risk of these 6 global threats.
Was because the nuclear weapon states have ignored their obligation under the Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for many, many years. That obligation is to commence comprehensive negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And the frustration level of so many states in the world up to a boiling point, which erupted with the beginning movement to abolish nuclear. It took the form of 3 conferences in 2014 and 2015 in Oslo, Nayarit, Mexico, and that led to the General Assembly start negotiations for it. To actually eliminate nuclear, but raise temperature sort of is the global norm world against the possession of nuclear weapons, and it stigmatizes illegal, certainly as well as immoral, and thus the nuclear weapon states have fought back and have refused to sign this new treaty that was adopted on July the 7th, 2017. They've refused to sign it and are working actively to hold back the number of ratifications that are required before the treaty comes into effect. Some 50 states will have to ratify it before it can come into effect, and we're a long way from that goal. Nonetheless, the importance of the treaty is to stimulate the creative thinking and raise a political pressure on governments and have civil society react to the nuclear weapons problem in the world today. And I believe that it has accomplished that initial goal. But as we can see from what is happening in the world today, the nuclear weapons situation has reached a crisis point that we have not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, or even since the start of the Cold War. And thus, the new sort of war, as they say, a cyber war between the United States and Russia is already going on, and the negotiations is very difficult, which, of course, is precisely why they should be engaged in diplomatic talks and as well as negotiations, not only on the North Korea and United States front of that problem, but on the wider front of the existence of nuclear weapons.
The petition asks that the Canadian government sign onto the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and it has reached about 700 and 800 signatures now, so it will be read at some point in the House of Commons by Pam Damoff. So that was one public means of pressuring of the Canadian government, which has refused to have anything to do with the treaty, probably because of pressure from the US and other NATO allies. But we believe that the position on nuclear weapons can and does differ amongst NATO members, and that Canada could sign on and lobby within NATO for a change in NATO's nuclear doctrine, which won't even rule out first use.
Yes, right. Now, this is, of course, you were speaking in Canada to an audience of Canadians primarily, but the project, How to Save the World in a Hurry, actually is designed to apply all around the world. And this treaty is a perfect example of something that can be done by any country. People are active, who are active in any country in the world, who want to do what they can to reduce the risk of nuclear war, should also be pressing their own governments to sign and ratify this treaty. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Just Australia, for an example, is which has taken positions similar to Canada's, but anywhere in the world.
Yes, right. Well, so if people want to know how they should go about it, they can get in touch with us through the website, tosavetheworld.ca, and we will tell them more about this and how, and maybe you can give us some advice about doing a petition. So we're going to, I think we may have lost Doug because he wasn't hearing us very well. But do you have other thoughts, Barbara, about ways in which we can reduce the risk of nuclear war beyond or apart from signing this treaty? Are there other things that we can do and other public policies that need to be adopted?
There's a UN high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament coming up in May, and we can urge Canada to go back to or go forward with more positive moves for nuclear disarmament there. I think other things that really must be done are taking nuclear weapons off high alert.
Yes.
That's an extremely important step.
As a matter of fact, one of the other proposals that have been submitted to us for the Platform for Survival reads this way. All nuclear weapon states shall immediately de-alert nuclear weapons, commit to no first use.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is something that every country, every country that has nuclear weapons, I mean, Canada is not one of them, but we certainly are part of NATO, which has nuclear weapons capacity and plans for even first use, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think we should do is try to counteract the deterrence doctrine that the nuclear powers and the umbrella states adhere to so much. I think there are a couple of arguments. One is that it's like bad parenting. If you threaten to do something but never do it, then people are not going to listen to you and do their own thing. The other thing is that even if deterrence has, to some extent, limited proliferation, which I think we doubt. Instead of having one nuclear weapon state, we now have 9 and thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. But even if it had some validity, like many medical procedures, the risks of this medication are worse than the benefits, and that it's not a doctrine that we should adhere to.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much, Barbara. And thanks to Doug, too. I think he's no longer visible on our screen, but we will be able to hear him, his voice on the record. So I want to move on because we did not receive any questions with regard to nuclear weapons. So we are going to go on now to the next topic that we're going to be addressing, which is global warming, or people normally say climate change these days. I don't know why. It doesn't make any difference to me. But I think we have here two people who are very devoted to working on this area. David Berman is present, and Lloyd Helferty. Both of you guys are friends of mine who live near Toronto or in Toronto and are doing work on global warming. So I'm not sure what you have you want to talk about, but I do know that we have several concerns that you want to talk about that are related to the Platform for Survival proposals. You may have different opinions about which ones you prefer or that you think are most important. I may say, by the way, before starting with you, that many of the ones that are on the list are ones that I drew directly from the Drawdown book. And I think both of you are doing work with that very interesting research project Drawdown. So you may want to talk about one or more of those proposals. So, hello guys. Who wants to start off? Lloyd, how about you?
I believe David will start.
All right.
Okay, I'll start. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So when we had our first introduction to Project Drawdown in Toronto, January 31st, I opened the space by connecting with the land itself, because I think it's, especially in this time of attempted reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, I think it's time to remember that the Mother Earth is not a metaphor. That in every real possible sense, we're not on the Earth, we are of the Earth. Environment is an actually misnomer. Environment is not around us, it is us, we are it. There's no difference. Every atom of our body comes from the Earth. there's no way around it. The earth is our mother. And from an indigenous perspective, she is also conscious and has a spirit. If in our popular imagination, which has come all the way from the Enlightenment and from colonization, from a European tradition. In fact, the papal bull of 1455 authorized any Christian king to confiscate any property of non-Christians, especially Africans and what they called Saracens or Muslims, to confiscate the property and enslave them in perpetuity, opening the world to the slave trade and colonization, but also to spreading a basically Christian message of coming from Genesis, of subdue the world and everything on it. So this, I think, has spread through the Enlightenment, through it. Really, all our institutions are based on this principle, whether we actually believe it or not, or believe in it or not, that we are masters of the world. The world has no inherent meaning. In fact, the whole concept of profane is really being close to the earth. And so in our imagination, we have to imagine something different. And I think a taking on a larger worldview of sacredness and relationship, reciprocal relationship. So we don't have a relationship to the earth, we have a relationship with the earth. And I think I'm thinking that having that sort of worldview will actually help us. So we have Polly Higgins in the UK, who's a lawyer, who's taken on the earth as her client.
How interesting.
And she is working in the UN to make ecocide a crime comparable to crimes against humanity as an obstacle to world peace. Mm-hmm. And she's getting some traction there. So she has a whole European movement at the UN to eradicate ecocide. And so that's just an example. The LEAP Manifesto in Canada, which is spreading, is a similar movement, which is builds on First Nations worldviews. It's not such an exotic concept. Of course, every Buddhist and every Hindu also has similar concepts of relationship with the earth in a reciprocal way. So it actually isn't as far-fetched as one might think. So I'm proposing that we work from that basis of that ecocide is a crime, that it's a crime against the basis of not only human life, but more than human life, that we are related to every being on earth, human and otherwise. And anything we do to any part of life, we are doing to ourselves. So I'll stop there and let Lloyd build on that.
Yeah, Lloyd, I want to draw attention to something that I know you're deeply interested in, and you do a lot of work on climate smart agriculture. There's a particular proposal that has been submitted to the Platform for Survival, which I'll read to you. It says FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization, right? The World Food Outfit. The FAO shall promote and fund expansion of climate smart agriculture, including biochar. Now, there's some terms in there that I'm a little familiar with, but most of our viewers may not be. So if you can tell us a little about what climate smart agriculture is and why we should be interested in using biochar.
Okay, well, I am coming into the Science for Peace program for how to save the world from a perspective of both an environmentalist as well as an engineer or a technologist, somebody that works with technologies and business. And I'm actually coming in less That's from the perspective of changing policy. Let's say at a governmental level, as changing behavior, and looking at means by which we can tackle some of the issues that we're dealing with and facing from the perspective of human behavior, and thinking about what it is we need to actually do, change those behaviors for the better, for the good. So my main topics of interest actually within the 6 main categories are not just global warming, but actually also famine. So I am coming at it from 2 perspectives, thinking about food security, thinking about long-term sustainability of our food supply, and thinking about how local communities can address both of these issues, not just in terms of what governments set in terms as far as policy, but also in terms of what communities set in terms of the policies are set locally, and what is set in terms of business policy as well, how businesses behave within an economy. So, as an example, I am a strong proponent of the B Corporation, or the for-benefit corporations, and that structure of business, as opposed to have only the for-benefit corporations, as opposed to having only the for-profit corporations and the non-for-profit corporations, not just thinking about profit as the only motivation for a business, but thinking about social purpose as the raison d'etre for having a business. Whether it's for-profit or non-profit is irrelevant if the goals of the business are to achieve a result, or a certain result, that is not related actually to money itself, but are related to social goals or other goals, environmental goals, that are defined by the charter of the corporation itself, where we don't just think about money. I think we're overly dominant to this money system, which I think, as David had pointed out, is a system that has been imposed upon us by the systems that have been put in place, these colonial systems, where we think only in terms of money, but we should be thinking in terms of community and people and benefits and the environment we live in, the Mother Earth. Like, what benefits Mother Earth? What benefits us? And there, you think about those questions, you actually find they're usually the same answers.
But Lloyd, can you explain a little bit about what ClimateSmart Agriculture is and what Biochar is? Yes,
and I'm getting to that. But what I am approaching this how to save the world problem is, as I say, it's not necessarily just from the policy of the governments. So since I'm focusing on these 2 main issues of global warming and famine, or food, I've been thinking about how it is that we can set policies both in the public as well as the private realms, and community realms. And so I have come across a few concepts, one of which is this so-called climate-smart agriculture. And climate-smart agriculture was a concept created by the United Nations through some negotiations that took place in Europe many years ago, and resulted in this movement by the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, to create something that they were calling ClimateSmart Agriculture, and which really embodies in large part what I believe is could be one of the major solutions to these issues of climate change and food security, or the potential for famine as a result of being unable to really organize ourselves around our food system and releasing ourselves to the dominance of the colonial corporate food system. So the UNFAO really actually developed this during a side event in The Hague in 2010. So it's been around now for almost 8 years. And it really is, what it means is something very simple. It means approaching the technical, policy, and investment conditions to achieve sustainable agriculture or sustainable food systems and food security under climate change. But it doesn't just mean preventing hunger. It's designed to, as they say, operationalize sustainable agricultural development within the context of climate change. And also, there's more than one objective. It's not just about the food. It's not just about the sustainability. It's not just about the climate. It also means, when they say climate smart agriculture, it talks about nutrition as well. Because there are a lot of people in this world who are overfed. Overabundance is a health issue. Obesity now, where we have a food system that doesn't deliver nutritious diets. We get famine on one end, and we get obesity on the other end. So we have to adapt our systems of food production and distribution so that it becomes more localized, more democratized, and is leveraged in such a way so that it can deliver the proper nutrition while also tackling issues like climate change, indirectly or directly.
Can you give us something? This resolution or this proposal includes the word biochar. Can you please explain what biochar is and how it is important for this project of having climate smart food?
Yeah. So I've been involved in the biochar initiatives globally for almost 10 years.
What is it?
And biochar is essentially agricultural charcoal. That's what it means. What it really is not is a silver bullet or any sort of something that can lead to radical change. What we can do with biochar, however, is sequester carbon and remove it from the carbon cycle or the long-term carbon cycle of the earth. So biochar is essentially a byproduct or co-product of bioenergy, or the two primary bioenergy processes, meaning pyrolysis and gasification. I've actually been working, although I've been working with biochar for many years, I don't consider myself to be an expert in biochar. I consider myself to be an expert in carbon more than the actual charcoal itself, and as a soil amendment or within the farming systems. What I'm looking at is biochar as a carbon that is stable, that allows for the sequestration of the labile carbon, the carbon that's moving through the carbon cycle, into a stable form, or recalcitrant carbon pools. And so what this means is we can have a system of agriculture if we're using a stable form of carbon within that system of agriculture. We can have a system of agriculture that can actually sequester carbon and remove carbon from the carbon cycle. So where we have food production, we can begin to think about how that food production can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So with an organization, for instance, like 350.org, warning us of the potential dangers of increasing our carbon dioxide equivalent emissions in the atmosphere above 350 parts per million, and saying, well, this beyond which is likely going to result in us achieving tipping points where we're going to have a runaway global warming, and whereas our climate now, our CO2 equivalent levels of carbon dioxide are now at above 400 parts per million. How can we possibly get back down to 350 or less? We need to pull carbon back out of the atmosphere and permanently sequester it back into the earth, back into the Mother Earth. How do we do this? So this is one of the roles of biochar, and I've been developing a program we're calling ClimateSmart Food that is leveraging both the biochar and the natural systems to help achieve these two goals of global warming and hopefully preventing famine.
Perfect.
So
Thank you both. I appreciate very much your contributions on this, and I'm going to move on now because we have John Daniele on with us. And John, you are a cyber expert, a forensic cyberman. So I'm looking to you to tell us how we're going to resolve and prevent the kinds of threats that we see in the newspaper every day now about the work that has been done lately and is going on, the ways in which the internet can be used as a weapon or connected to other weapons, and the way it has been used to influence the outcomes of elections and steal money from banks and the whole thing. So which of these proposals, if any, from the existing platform for survival, or the submissions we've received so far for the platform, what do you think is the most promising way of reducing the threat of cyber attacks in the future?
So I think one of the leading proposals that had been tabled is the adoption of the consensus report written by the United Nations group of governmental experts on developments in the field of information technology, which was a report issued in 2015. And in it sought to establish international norms, rules, principles concerning behavior within cyberspace, particularly as it pertains to nation-state activity in cyberspace. And I think this is probably one of the best things that we can do in order to prevent large-scale cyber war. If we can develop a means of understanding what are those norms that we should necessarily abide by, what constitutes cyber war, what sort of actions and activities do nation states need to avoid? These are these are areas that are currently very, very murky. There's not a lot of consensus yet in terms of what constitutes a cyber attack. So I think the more that we can discuss an establishment of some form of international norm in this area, the more secure that each nation state will necessarily become. One of the key elements here is trying to prevent nation states from engaging in full-scale cyber warfare activities against another opposing nation state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, I mean, you've mentioned exactly the thing that I have here that I will read that was already proposed as one of the items for the Platform for Survival. All states shall implement the 2015 UN Consensus Report of Governmental Experts on IT and Communications. So do you know what all they went through in negotiating this thing? Was it going to be something like a treaty, or what was the intention, or what were the recommendations? Do you know of any of those experts?
I think the purpose was to start a dialogue amongst the different nations of the world on these critical issues. And the interesting part is this was first introduced in 1998 by the Russian Federation. They had highlighted concerns about the potential for nation states to use cyber warfare type activities to affect and influence and change circumstances, situations of a political nature within Russia. So it's interesting that that today, many years later, we have an environment where Russia is not necessarily abiding by the proposed norms that they had tabled back in 1998, which principally laid out non-interference non-interference of critical infrastructure of another nation state. And certainly with Russia and its activities in Estonia and Latvia, clearly they're not abiding by their own draft resolution that they had tabled back in 1998. But that was the original intention, to table a discussion about international norms and rules concerning cyber activities, cyber warfare activities, interference in critical infrastructure, and that does remain the main focus of the report. When you take a look at the different responses from the different nations that had participated on this governmental panel, there's a focus on developing incident response infrastructure, and particularly if you take a look at Canada's submission and response to the 2015 report principally focuses on what Canada has done to develop the infrastructure to be able to respond to cyber attacks. And I think this is definitely a step in the right direction. Developing national infrastructure to respond to cyber attacks is something that's critically important to any nation state.
Tell me what that would look like. What exactly do we need? And are you suggesting that we don't have it? I'm thinking about Canada now specifically, but should Canada be acquiring new technologies that you understand that they're not doing?
Well, Canada has taken some steps to develop what's called CSIRC, which is a centralized group responsible for incident response. I think what we're still in the process of developing is a national infrastructure to implement this, developing greater capacity to respond to large scale cyber attacks is something that I think we still need to do a lot more work on here in this country. And certainly if you take a look at the state of cybersecurity in other countries around the world, this is an area that I think every nation state needs to focus on in terms of developing that defensive infrastructure to be able to respond to cyber attacks.
Okay, well now, you talk about respond, that sounds like a military response of some kind. In other words, if you do it to us, we'll hit you back harder. What I'm thinking is, I've heard that there are all kinds of ways in which our infrastructure is set up that could be decentralized and made less vulnerable. I mean, I mean, you have to tell me how seriously we should worry about such things as the notion that an enemy, if we had one, could attack the electric grid and knock us out for a long period of time. I think there was a book called Lights Out by recent television. Used to be a television anchorman in the evening. I can never remember his name. And anyway, he wrote a book called Lights Out about how it would be easy for an enemy to just destroy our electric grid because it's all one big system. Now, I've heard people say that if, to the extent that we have solar power, for example, on our roofs, and we don't depend on running it through the grid, but can actually have autonomous electrical systems in our own houses, that makes us less vulnerable. That houses are, not everybody's going to be hooked up to the same thing. But I've also heard a lot of speculation about the Internet of Things and how dangerous that is going to be. Maybe it is already. I think it's, I don't know how far along we are in developing that, but the notion that many of our appliances and things around our household and offices will be hooked up to the internet and controlled so that somebody could get a password or find a way to hack in and say, turn on our electric stove and unlock our front door and, go around the house destroying all kinds of things, not just one house, but a whole town or whole city, or knock out the new, the electric cars and that kind of thing. That as we develop this Internet of Things, we're centralizing rather than decentralizing and making ourselves more vulnerable rather than less. Now, is this just my fantasy, or is this something we should worry about and something we should do something about?
Well, I think when it comes to the IoT type technology, we're in the very early stages of developing a proper infrastructure to secure IoT. Most organizations can't even gain visibility into what sort of IoT devices they have. But when you think about the little sensors that could be developed and implemented in a wide variety of different systems, being able to keep track of it, being able to manage it in a centralized fashion becomes important. Being able to ensure that the firmware code that was designed to operate that device was developed in a secure manner, and that the supply chain network for the components within those devices weren't compromised in some way that results in either a safety or a security or a privacy concern. I think it's all a very legitimate line of inquiry.
But am I understanding you right? You don't think that it? I don't hear you saying that there's a solution that people building these systems could do otherwise. Is this some sort of inevitable thing that's going on where we're all going to be hooked together and nobody can quite stop it? Or what? How serious is this? And are there planners working on methods of decentralizing them so that you're not all not everybody in the world is vulnerable to one hacker?
Well, a very decentralized system is also a difficult system to manage as well. But as it pertains to IoT, right now, I think most organizations are driven by profit and less by a motivation to develop good, secure standards for the development, the deployment, the management of this kind of infrastructure. So we don't actually have very many standards with respect to how do we tackle this problem of IoT. And as a result of that, it's made us very insecure. It's sort of like the Wild West right now, where even your home baby monitor or security camera can be compromised and put up on an internet link for everybody to view. these devices are also a window into your environment. So from a corporate perspective, if you have IoT in your environment that is not properly secure, a hacker can use that as a pivot point in order to gain access to much more sensitive information that you might be securing elsewhere in your corporate network. So it's an interesting and complex challenge that we have right now. I don't see enough cooperation, especially international cooperation, to tackle these issues, and that's one area that I think I'd definitely like to see change in the years ahead. A much more cooperation on the development of standards and common frameworks to be able to secure a wide range of vulnerable technology today.
Okay, would you be so good as to write an addition to the Platform for Survival, a proposal along those lines? Because I don't think we have anything proposed yet, and it sounds to me like this group of governmental experts in 2015 came up with something that would maybe preserve us from some kind of attacks on our big infrastructure, but it would not necessarily protect us from things like hackers getting in, opening our garage door when we don't want them to, and so on. So maybe you can write a proposal that would encompass things like that. Okay, I have a question here from Sandra Lee Lester. If I can ask you to answer it. What about developing security systems that are robust enough to guard against brute force hacks by quantum computing?
Well, I think quantum computing is an interesting area. Where I think this is going to get where quantum computing and security are going to have a nexus is in the area of enabling artificial intelligence technology, machine learning. If we do have a viable quantum computer, the computing power can be applied to solving really complex problems that are used to develop machine learning type technologies. And why that could present an issue is if you take a look at the different kinds of means of authenticating access to systems today, and we have different dual factor authentication methods that take into account user behavior, that present maybe complex pictures on the screen that you would have to choose from and identify. And this is something that computers don't do very well today. Quantum computers can enable AI to be able to understand what those behaviors would necessarily be and mimic real user behavior and defeat some of these multi-layer or multi-factor authentication mechanisms. So I think that's definitely a legitimate concern. It's not something that's a realistic concern today, but 10 years from now or less, I think these kinds of attacks will become more commonplace. We also have organizations that are hijacking websites to tap into the computing power of systems to engage in cryptocurrency mining. I think in the future, what we'll also see is harnessing that computing power in order to fuel AI-based cyber attacks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very, very interesting. And I want to not only ask you, John, if you want to formulate a proposal for the platform, but everybody, all the viewers who have thoughts about any of these concerns, do the same thing. If you go to our website, tosavetheworld.ca, and look at the platform for survival as it exists now, the submissions, and then you can add to them, and then we'll pick from them later on. But thank you very much for this, John. See you later. I'm going to turn now to Vinay Jindal, who's joining us on screen, right? You don't see him, but I see him beside you, John. Bye. Hi, Vinay. How are you?
Hi,
Vinay is a physician, a family doctor in Scarborough, Ontario, and he is the president of the Physicians for Global Survival. It's an organization of doctors who are worried and concerned and committed to working on the prevention of war, among other things. I mean, there are good deeds of all kinds to be done by physicians, including, of course, the prevention of disease or pandemics. So, Vinay, hi.
Hi.
Good to see you. Can you? We're going to talk a little bit about pandemics. I don't know whether you have decided which of these proposals that have come in so far.
I took a little different approach because pandemics is something that certainly I learned about as a physician, but I did want to review the information about pandemics. I just want to add that Rebecca is looking for the link, so if somebody can send her the link to get onto Be Live TV, then she'll be able to join us shortly as the second speaker on this.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, so I wanted to review some of the definitions just to give me some background and to share some background on pandemics and to say why it is important to become part of the platform for survival. And in doing that also, it might help us identify some areas where intervention can be made to stop pandemics. I'm also a volunteer with Doctors Without Borders. I worked with them in Myanmar back in 2006 on an HIV, AIDS, and TB project. And we diagnosed and treated marginalized populations with antiretrovirals and TB medication. So one of the major things for me is that I learned that it is possible, through my experience, to provide complicated and daily care, regimented care to marginalized and disadvantaged groups through that. But as I speak today, I'm speaking as an individual, and my comments don't represent MSF in any way. So a pandemic, it refers to an increase, often a sudden increase in the number of cases of a disease that has spread over several countries or continents and has affected a large number of people. If we look at the most recent pandemic, it was in 2009. It was the H1N1 virus, which started from swine. And that's estimated to be responsible for anywhere from 150,000 to 500,000 deaths worldwide. And that's in 2009.
Danae, was that an epidemic of flu or what?
The H1N1 virus was in 2009. That was an influenza virus, but it wasn't the seasonal flu. That was an extra flu that came around at that time.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't remember if you recall, but 2009, all the doctors were giving out flu shots, and then halfway through the winter, a new flu shot came available. So everybody had to get a second flu shot that year to deal with the H1N1 swine flu that was going around. Now, usually the seasonal flu would affect the elderly people or vulnerable populations, the very young, the ill people. But the thing about pandemics and the H1N1 is it affected more young and healthy people and led to more severe symptoms such as viral pneumonia and death. If we look back, though, there was an even more dramatic example of a pandemic flu, which is called the Spanish flu of 1918, and that caused anywhere from 20 to 50 million deaths in less than a year. And once again, that flu attacked the young and healthy population, as well as the elderly and those with comorbidities. So in contrast to the pandemics, which is what the topic is today, an epidemic is a similar issue of illness and disease that spreads, but it's usually contained within a geographical area or within a country or a group of countries. Now, an interesting example of that, of an epidemic that would be important for us on how to save the world, is after the devastating earthquake in Haiti in 2010, the UN sent many peacekeepers to Haiti to help keep the peace and help in their efforts to redevelop or to manage the disaster. Unfortunately, cholera was introduced to the country by infected UN peacekeepers from Nepal. And since then, over the last 7 years, there have been over 800,000 cholera cases in Haiti and approximately 10,000 deaths. So as we talk about how to save the world, we have to also think about what the implications are of our actions. And we might end up with results that we don't want. And then an outbreak is similar to an epidemic, but it's on a much smaller scale usually. And a very quick note is that in 2017, there was a mumps outbreak in Toronto, and public health launched an educational campaign targeting young adults who were attending bars in West Toronto, as that was found to be the source of the mumps outbreak. Now, generally, when we talk about pandemics, we're talking about flu viruses that go around, but not the seasonal flu. It's a worse type of flu. And there's different factors that come in to the development of pandemic. So, for example, if a virus can easily be spread within a population, more of the population will be exposed to the virus, leading to more cases of the disease, and particularly the people who are susceptible, who don't have any immunity, or very young or elderly, they will come down with the flu and pandemic type flu. And that can happen especially in urban settings or in shelters or refugee camps where perhaps the sanitary conditions and the immunity of the people are not quite as strong. If a more virulent or a stronger strain of the virus develops, such as an unexpected mutation in a traditional flu virus, it can leave a population without any immunity, as the case of the Spanish flu in 1918. Or if a virus is new to the area and the population has no immunity or experience that the virus can be particularly the population can be particularly susceptible. And that's what happened with the SARS outbreak in Toronto and around the world. Now, if a virus... I understand
that the new viruses that come in that are really scary new viruses that we're not used to usually come from contact with animals. And that as populations move around because of global warming and so on, they're coming much more often into contact with animals where they can, the virus is transferred from the animal into the human population.
Good timing. Yeah, that was my next point. So if a virus develops better transmission routes from its avian, bird, or swine pig sources to humans, that also, if it transmits better between animals to humans, that would make a difference. Or also, and then beyond that, it has to be able to spread from human to human very easily. And that can lead to a pandemic. So just as you mentioned, swine flu, it generally doesn't actually transmit to humans very well. But in 2009, the H1N1 pandemic, it was a variant virus, a combination virus that developed in swine, and it actually had good transmission to humans and between humans, and that led to a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So in talking about preventing or managing pandemics, there's different issues that can be addressed at different levels. And as you were talking about, we can start by addressing the virus according to the animal of origin. We can monitor the potential viruses that are developing in the birds or in the pigs and monitor which ones are developing, consider how we're managing the animals, how we're handling them, how we're farming them, and if we're putting not only the animals at risk, but humans at risk of viruses developing, and prepare early by monitoring those virulent strains. Another issue would be to support scientific development of research into viral identification, monitoring, and vaccine development. A very important issue, as we talked about with the public health issue, is educate the public on behaviors that reduce the human-to-human transmission of viral infections. The basic things that we all know about hand washing, coughing, or sneezing into your sleeve, but also identifying the symptoms of the flu and learning to quarantine ourselves, stay home from school or work from home, don't go to work, call in sick, just to make sure that you don't spread the virus into the community.
Okay, may I introduce a newcomer to our gathering here? This is, I don't know whether you can see her, Renee, but Becky Dendalian.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I am able to hear you a little bit. You have to tell us who you are, because I have not met you, and I don't know you at all. So it's wonderful that
this is my pseudo
Becky something.
My pseudo Facebook name. So it's Dandelion, because my last name is Lion, and I just embedded it into a.
Your last name is Lion, and you've changed your name to Becky Dandelion?
Dandelion.
Okay. That's your Facebook name. Oh, all right.
Yes,
well, I didn't know you were. I thought somehow interesting that Becky had sent us one of her friends because she couldn't make it. I was trying to fantasize what what has happened here, but my goodness. Okay, Becky, welcome.
Me, I swear.
Okay. I hear you've had a little trouble getting a connection or something. But anyway, I do know about you then. And I know that you are a graduate student in public health at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, right? And
That's right.
And presumably you're taking courses that have something to do with infectious disease and the suppression thereof, right? Tell us about what you have been studying. I think you know a bit about Ebola. Is that right?
Well, what I was going to bring up is actually our health policy class assigned us a really interesting article on health addressed SARS. And so that was actually what I wanted to touch upon today. About
okay.
SARS. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Let me just look at my notes here, because so my focus is in health promotion, also known as social influences. So I took one intro course in epidemiology as a good overview, but I certainly need to continue to learn. And I was really excited actually.
Okay.
Back in 2006, titled "My Wish, Help Me Next." And that gave me a wonderful overview to understand Larry's work in the eradication of, just look here, smallpox, and his conversations about big data. And so these higher level terms are floating around in academia, and I'm finally to understand its context. So I'm really grateful today to talk about SARS, a local example, but also viewed. So if I could jump in, so let's see. So I did a bit of research. I drew from the Center for Disease Control, and SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. It's a viral respiratory illness, and SARS was first reported in Asia in 2003. And over the next few months, the illness spread primarily by close person-to-person contact, as mentioned, and spread to more than 2 countries in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia before the outbreak was contained. According to the World Health Organization,
I want to know
8,098 people worldwide became sick with SARS, and of these, 774 died.
You don't hear me.
Article that I mentioned, it's called SARS, A Local Public Health Perspective.
Rebecca?
And so, according to the article, this pandemic led to the first declaration of emergency by the province of Ontario. So, in summary of this journal article that I would like to share with you today, the first case of by Toronto Public Health, March 9th of 2003, as a possible case of tuberculosis. However, with negative TB tests and a continued illness experienced by family members, Toronto Public Health held a press conference 5 days later to activate an emergency response plan, a public information hotline, and assign full-time staff for outbreak investigation. And as stated by Dr. Brilliant, early detection is crucial to contain this pandemic that never was. In 2003, there was no diagnostic test, no formal vaccine for SARS. There were no formal information systems at the time in place at the start of the outbreak, nor the wide-scale management needed for in quarantine. So I just wanted to share some important takeaways from that article. The response required coordinated efforts from local health authorities. The outbreak in Toronto was contained. Limited exposure beyond hospital staff, patients, household members, and visitors of known cases. Disease transmission rarely occurred outside healthcare settings. To summarize the lessons learned, the need for the province to revise guidelines to prevention and control of infectious disease, i.e. policy change, a call for complete, accurate, and timely information about cases to understand the epidemiology of the outbreak.
Okay, I guess we have to move on. Our time is we need to move on to the next topic. And we are concerned, of course, not only with pandemics, but also with the possible exposure to radiation. Vinay, do you have something you want to add before we move on to speaking about radiation? Okay.
Well, you know what? I think the pandemic is actually a very important topic. It's a matter of when the next pandemic is going to happen. The suggestions online, there's only about 4 points so far on pandemics, but it's actually a very important issue. And I think that there's many points where we can actually make a difference in terms of preventing a pandemic from happening again. So hopefully we'll have some more activity on this area on the how to save the world in a hurry.
Okay, thank you, Vinay. Now let's move on and talk about radiation. Robin, you're not into radiation.
No.
No, you're not. But I think we should. We do have Angela Bischoff here, and I thought we were going to have Dale Dewar. Where is Dale Dewar? But Angela, it's good of you to be with us, and I'll get to Robin in a little while. But I think that you want to. You're an expert, really, on. I think you're with the Clean Air Alliance in Toronto, and working on dealing with the threats of exposure to radiation in our environment as a result of mostly of nuclear power plants. Is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. In our environment. Tell us about tell us a bit about the Canadian use of nuclear energy and how that may be affecting us.
Okay, and I hope Stefan can get Dale online, because Dale was going to complement my presentation by talking about radiation. So I'm going to speak more about begin the conversation that Dale and I were going to have by addressing the role that nuclear power plays globally and why we need to move to a renewable future, why we need to phase out all nuclear power plants on the planet. And that's one of the 10 things that is on your list, Meta. Mm-hmm. You've got 10 things about radiation, and phasing out nuclear power is a big part of that. That's what I'd like to address. That's the goal.
I tell you, before we go on, I'll read that one, the first one that had been submitted to us for the Platform for Survival. It says, all states shall undergo and publicize IAEA safety reviews of existing and planned nuclear reactors. And the second one says, within 2 years, all states shall plan to secure and phase out nuclear power plants. I see that is one that is dear to your heart, right? Phasing out nuclear power plants.
Yeah, and it's doable. I mean, there have been lots of studies that have been done in recent years. One is the Solutions Project. That's Mark Jacobson, that claims we can go 100% renewable by 2050 without nuclear, without fossil fuels. And they're being released regularly studies saying the same thing. Then we'll have people that say, oh, we need nuclear as part of the mix. But really, every dollar spent on nuclear power is a dollar not spent moving us to the renewable future. And, the nuclear fleet around the world are bomb-producing factories. They are terrorist targets. They release routinely radioactivity into the air and into our water every day. They're potential large accident sites. Why would we continue investing trillions of dollars, which is what the nuclear industry is asking for, 1,000 new nuclear reactors to be built out over the next couple of decades? That will cost trillions of dollars. We should be putting all that time, energy, person power into moving renewable. And we can do that around the world. And in Ontario is a great little context for us to consider. The province of Ontario, we are the second most nuclearized jurisdiction on the planet, second only to France. And we're about to rebuild our entire nuclear fleet, locking us in for another 5 decades, rebuilding 12 reactors and extending the life of 6. And we could very easily instead turn our attention to moving Ontario to a renewable future, importing water power from Quebec, building out wind and solar. The whole world is moving in that direction. In fact, you know, globally, when you look at the number of reactors right now, there's somewhere around 450. But in recent years, that's come down to there are now only 405 active working nuclear reactors. And that number, the trajectory is just continually going down because the age of the nuclear fleet is getting old now, and every year there are more reactors that are being shut down than are being started up. And in fact, there are very few reactors being started up, especially post-Fukushima. Many have been canceled, and countries around the world have made commitments to phase out their nuclear fleets and to ban them even. And so Ontario is, I mean, the only countries really that are investing in new nuclear reactors are China and India, and it's questionable how many of those will actually get built. So the trajectory.
Let me ask you. I had it was in a conversation with somebody who said that in the developed countries, nuclear power is on the way out. That they're not building new ones on any scale at all. I guess Ontario being one of the exceptions. But where nuclear power plants are being built is in what used to be called the developing world, the not rich countries yet. Is that true now? This was a couple of years ago. Is there a definite trend in terms of where the nuclear industry is moving and developing and where it's not?
Well, there are just a handful of individual reactors being built, but there's a couple of dozen in China, and half a dozen or a dozen in India, and beyond that, there's just the odd one here and there. So if we took China and India out of the mix, the nuclear industry is really hooped. In fact, in the last couple of years, we've seen the bankruptcy of the 2 largest nuclear companies in the world, Areva from France and Westinghouse. So literally, the industry is a dying industry. More reactors are being shut every year than opening. And the opportunity for the industry really is in decommissioning. That's the monetary opportunity. And likewise here in Ontario, the opportunity, rather than rebuilding our station to create jobs, because let's face it, that's the primary motivation, is maintaining jobs. We could easily be creating as many jobs in the decommissioning of the stations. Plus, we're going to be needing skilled workers to manage the waste for a very, very long time. So, yeah.
Okay, good. I see we have a new friend here. Here's Dale Dewar. You finally got back online, Dale. Hello, Dale.
Yes.
Sorry? Dale Dewar is with us. She's in Saskatchewan someplace, I think in some small town. I believe that, Dale's talking and I'm talking. We can't hear each other, Dale.
Yeah, I realize that. I'm close to a town called Beachy. It's an interesting area in Saskatchewan. It's very, very flat in one half of it. The other half of it is so rolling that it affects it's very ranch community, and the people that I have been seeing as patients/clients have been mainly ranchers who've been there, living there for, the last 100 years, somewhere or other as family. Anyway, very interesting culture.
Tell us about your work with radiation. You are the author of a very interesting book that I used when I was teaching a class a couple of years ago called From Hiroshima to Fukushima to You. Wonderful title, about the risks of radiation and the effects on the human body's cells.
Yes, and also I'd like to comment that I heard what Angela was saying, and I certainly agree with. I mean, she certainly set me up for being able to talk about the fact that you've got all of these potential spots of radiation-affected populations in Ontario, and in fact, Toronto is quadruply, at least, threatened. Radiation is an interesting thing in that you have to think of it in terms of small pellets hitting your cells, the cells in your body. And in every cell in your body, you have your normal DNA, which is kind of like the master planet or the master engineer running how that cell should get energy, not get energy, live, die, whatever. And this master guru in the plant, in the cell, can be hit by the radiation. The radiation can change what that master wishes the cell to do. And it can either set the cell on the road to multiplication, which is a type of cancer, or it can set the cell to die, which usually doesn't cause much effect when there's only one cell dying. So this pellet that we're thinking of as kind of a bullet from the gun that changes the structure of a cell may actually also go through a cell and do nothing at all. So how do we know which is which? Well, the way I think that most physicians feel is that we have to look at ionizing radiation as safety first. And since we don't know for sure whether any particular cell is affected by radiation, we have to suggest that most cells might be affected by radiation. Therefore, the effect of radiation can be either cancer, changing the cell's direction into autoimmune diseases and affecting them that way, or ultimate cell death.
I know that our real concern is to prevent a catastrophe on the scale of Fukushima or Chernobyl. That we are, insofar as we're talking about how to save the world from various catastrophes, we're not talking about everyday background radiation or even radiation that is unwise. I mean, for example, the exposure of miners, uranium miners, and so on. We're talking more about the possibility of a catastrophe like an explosion or something. Do you, either of you, have any sense of the extent of the current risk of radiation from reactors? Has much been done to regulate and to prevent? I mean, the very fact that you could have something like a Fukushima as recently as it did occur certainly puts the rest of us on guard. You know, it's a little scary. And I wonder if you have any sense of whether or not anything is being done to reduce this threat. Are reactors all around the world being regularly inspected? And if they are, how rigorously are they being inspected? And have any of them been shut down because they've been found to be poorly designed or breaking down or something of that kind? What can you tell us about the current status of the riskiness of existing reactors?
Okay, I would like to respond first, and then I think that probably Angela knows a lot more about the situation in Ontario. And I'm going to simply respond with describing what has happened in the past with regarding to that. The idea that they are regularly assessed. Best examples occurred right in Canada, and that is when Linda Keene shut down Chalk River because it had failed to provide the safety measures that she had required of it 1 year previously, so they had a year to work on it. They had not provided the safety measures. She shut it down as the regulator in CNSC. She was fired by the Canadian government. That tells you where the real power in terms of whether or not a power plant can continue to exist or not. And in this case, it was with the Canadian government. Angela, do you want to continue with that comment?
Well, the Canadian Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I mean, we believe that it's a captured commission. They have never, in the history of the CNSC, they have never turned down a license in Canada. So, you know, the nuclear industry asks and the Regulatory Commission rubber stamps. It's a rubber stamp commission. So we understand that that's the same thing in the United States as well. So I don't know what, you know, what this situation is around the world. I guess I can't really comment, but certainly in Canada, we believe that the Regulatory Commission is captured by the industry.
Mm-hmm. What would we need to do to overcome that? That's a big question, isn't it? Because I even want to make it a bigger question instead of saying that just because I don't think it's just a Canadian problem. It's to me, everybody in the world has to be worried about all radiation from all reactors anywhere in the world. Because once it's around us, it's it doesn't stay there. It moves around. It gets to us, even if it's in Japan. That radiation can come to us. So everybody has to be concerned about it. And I think it's one of those things that's a global problem. Now, I guess the IAEA is the organization that is supposed to be looking after nuclear safety, right? And
yes, but just a minute, Meta.
I'm sorry?
Just a minute, Meta. You have to keep in mind that the IAEA is a compromised organization. Mm-hmm. It must monitor the safety, but it also must sell nuclear power to the world. It is told that it needs to promote nuclear power. So it is compromised by that very point that it both regulates and sells.
Okay, right there, it would seem to me, Dale, that is exactly the kind of point that we need to look at. Because if there is some place that has a global impact on radiation safety, and the IAEA is the place that clearly, if any outfit or organization of the world influences overall radiation safety, it would be that outfit. Now, doesn't it make sense that we should be working on trying to change the IAEA then? Because if we could fix exactly the problem that you just pointed out, that make sure that they're not in the business of trying to promote the nuclear industry, but be made much more accountable and more responsible to safety concerns, wouldn't that help? I mean, it seems to me that
Meta, of course, I don't think either Angela or I would find fault with your reasoning.
Okay.
And likewise, we need to be lobbying the World Health Organization to actually be doing serious studies on the consequences of nuclear power stations. But it's, I don't know about you, but it's really hard for me to imagine how I can change the WHO or the IAEA. But I think what we need to be, I can wrap my head around how can we change the situation in Ontario, which is, this second world's most nuclearized jurisdiction. And it means we have to rise up and oppose the extension of the Pickering nuclear station and the rebuilding of the Darlington and the Bruce nuclear stations. We need government to know that we want a renewable future. And, myself and Greenpeace and other groups are working to build opposition to these projects. And I invite people to be part of our networks and get our newsletter. I have a great newsletter called No Nukes News. And anybody can contact me. I can add you, and you can get engaged in the local movement. But I appreciate the goal, Meta, of your whole exercise is to get us thinking, more globally, and I appreciate the radiation risks you've outlined. And,
there, Meta. I think that you now have a way in which you have both approached the problem from the global issue, i.e., we really do have to tackle this particular tie-up between World Health Organization, which in 1958 agreed that anything that it had to do with radiation, it would refer first to the IAEA, and consequently that tied it up and so Angela has brought that particular step into the situation from the global to the local.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I personally don't think that we have to choose between global and local. I think we have to do both. And I think that there's even a room for people who are kind of utopian. And this exercise that we're doing, How to Save the World, is a very utopian exercise. So you'll just have to, I'm totally enthusiastic about supporting local work. And I think we can also dream big about doing things like changing the WHO and changing the IAEA. So the people who want to write in proposals to that effect, I invite you to do so, and we'll put them with the others on our platform for survival. And then on May 30th and 31st, we'll choose the ones that we think actually have the most potential for reducing the risks that we all are now worried about. Bless your hearts, both of you women. Thank you very much, and I'm going to move on. Good evening.
Thank you very much. Nice.
Okay. Now I want to bring in Robin Collins and Laura Schnurr. And I understand they're someplace in the electronic waiting room. Is that right? We have, hello, Robin, and hello, Laura.
Hi.
Let me introduce Laura first, although I don't know you as well as I know Robin. Laura Schnurr is a co-author of a new book about the United Nations reform, along with John Trent. Is that right? And it's something about UN Renaissance. Is that the title of the book?
Yes, exactly. It's a United Nations Renaissance. That's it. Okay,
great. And so we know your interest. You want to improve the United Nations, and I'm all for it. Whatever you want to do is all right with me. And Robin Collins, you are very active in the World Federalist Movement, I believe, and as well as a number, at least 3 other peace organizations that I'm familiar with. I think we all belong in the same one, some of them. So I'd like to hear, I think you would have chosen different proposals from the list that we submitted of public policy positions for this enabling measures category. I should explain that a little bit. In addition to the 6 global threats that we've been dealing with, it's going to be necessary to have some other public policy changes or structural changes, institutional changes, in order to facilitate any of a number of the other proposals that we want to enact. So things like, where do you get the money for this? Or what kind of organization do you need to build in order to make a certain policy feasible, and so on. So we have this additional category of enabling measures, which are a little bit more general, and they often apply to ways in which we can facilitate the adoption of some of the other measures for reducing specific global threats. That's why now we're talking about winding up by talking about the United Nations reform and some of the other measures that are in the enabling measures category on the platform for survival. With that, a little extra explanation, let me say that I think, Robin, your interest is in the United Nations Emergency Peace Service. So why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about that?
I was going to suggest we go the other way around, because I'm more of a subset of Laura. She's got sort of the broader picture on UN reform. That's okay.
All right, fine. Laura, why don't you tell us about reforming the UN?
Sure, happy to start. So yeah, as you mentioned, Meta, this is essentially something we need to do before we can tackle any of the other catastrophes, I would argue. So when listening to some of the other presenters this evening, it's really clear to me that for each and every one of the proposals that have been mentioned and each of the 6 catastrophes, reforming the UN, or I should just say the UN itself, is essential to achieving these. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that it might be difficult to achieve those measures with the current system. The UN system, we could say, is broken. It's in need of repair, or at least it's in need of reform. And it really hasn't changed much in the last 70 years. So it was established in more than 70 years now, 73 years, since 1945. And there are several indications of it having not kept up with the pace of change that we've witnessed and experienced. So I think that's sort of the number one thing. And then when we look at the proposals under the enabling measures, there are some interesting ones there. So I think what I might do is actually speak about a couple of themes that I see as underlying some of these proposals. So just to maybe mention a couple of them, there's a couple of the proposals are around independent financing. So that's one is states should donate 60% of savings from military cutbacks to UN agencies, which it's debatable whether or not their states are indeed cutting back on military. Certainly not all states are moving in that direction. But the point there is really, I think, it's looking for an innovative way to finance the UN. And another is the Tobin.
I would say this, sorry, but in my mind, at least, these two things are paired. Because if you look in the war and weapons section, there is a measure, one of the proposals is exactly that, to reduce standing armies and military structures by something like 80%. And if you did that, if you enacted that and actually made that happen, you would have some savings.
If you did, right. But that's assuming that works out, right. So exactly. So behind that one is the essentially the need for greater and regular financing for the UN, right? Because the current assessments are just not enough. There's regular member states assessments, and then there are voluntary contributions, and it amounts to too little for the UN to do its work. And another proposal in this list of measures here is the Tobin tax. Mm-hmm. And that's been proposed for a long time. Not only
Tobin, explain what that is, by the way.
Sure.
Yeah.
So a tax, an international tax or levy on international financial transactions, which is one of, I'd say it's a subset of many proposals that have gone forward over the years around different innovative sorts of taxes that we could, where we could find some additional capital for the UN to survive. So others have been suggested around taxes on air and sea travel, on arms sales. Many others have been proposed, but we've had challenges as well in really securing any of these. So a big challenge there is just states not wanting to to let the UN, to have the UN be properly resourced so that it can do its work. And that's really a big challenge. And so one alternative that's been proposed has been to replace the current system used to calculate member state assessments, replace this with a small and equal percentage of gross national income. So for example, if all states were to contribute 0.1% of their GNI to the UN, that would be a more simple way. But again, the question is, even if they were to do that, would states do this? Because at the moment there are regular assessments of their contributions, and they're not even all paying up. Even if they were, the UN would still have financing issues, but they're not all. So anyway, those are a couple I wanted to speak to, but I'd like to turn it over now to Robin to hear about.
Let me ask you about this. What you think is the most, I don't want to say reasonable, the most likely to be achievable. As you've just pointed out, if the countries already are not paying up their regular dues, it's hard to see how you can squeeze more out of them. But is there any way in which some of these alternative things could be more easily enacted and enforced? I mean, air travel taxes or mining of the seabed taxes or the Tobin tax on financial transactions. Would those be any easier to achieve?
Well, perhaps, but I'm a little skeptical as well because the proposals have been around for so long. So it almost feels as though if there were a quick win here, we'd have had it already, right? So I wonder if, and this is something we speak about quite a bit in the book, is just the need to create a real movement, a campaign behind UN reform that would do a few things, but one of which is actually raise awareness around the importance of the UN, because a lot of the news and a lot of the media coverage is quite negative around the UN. You hear, oh, the Security Council has blocked another resolution to sanction Syria, and we see a lot of like the challenges that they're facing to get anything done, but little about all the great achievements of the UN. It's actually an incredible achievement to have this organization supporting us through the past decades and potentially averting wars. There's a lot of things we can't even measure that the UN has done, and we maybe can't attribute to the UN, but they've supported us in so many ways. So part of a campaign would really be to raise awareness of the importance of the UN and some of the pitfalls as well, and areas where we need to reform. And I think if there's broad public support, so first I would argue that we need a campaign that's likely led by civil society organizations who are really at the forefront of this, and the World Federalist Movement is among them. If they were to garner public support behind this, and then we could translate that public support into political pressure and put pressure on our governments to act and to join this movement, we would have civil society and other non-state actors, and we would have governments working together to move this forward. And once there's an appreciation of the importance of the UN and the need for reform, then I think we might go back to that conversation of how we properly finance that institution. But I don't think we'll get that tax before we get that.
Thank you. Okay, Robin, let's hear about the UN Emergency Peace Service.
So I'm going to pull out of Laura's sort of broad look, but I will reiterate what she started with, which was the interesting observation we could make from the other people who were speaking is this continuity or this connection that they had with the centrality of the UN and almost all of the discussion that they had. They're either an institution or some link into the UN anyway, maybe a treaty. So the item I'm going to focus on is UNEPS, the UN Emergency Peace Service, and we use that phrase "service" rather than police, emergency force. even though there's a military component, because we see it as multifunctional, capable, and so not only military but police and diplomacy, civilian, and other elements. So the idea of a UNEPS would be to be brought into a conflict situation or close to conflict situation, and to quell a crisis before it became a serious war. The UNEP's idea would have in the area of 15,000 people, but they would be hired by the UN. They wouldn't be from national militaries. They would be UN hired, selected, trained. They would be ready to go. There'd be a standing capability, not a standby capability, which is what we have now. So the UN has a need to get into a serious crisis, a genocide in the making, and they have to go around looking for help from contributing states, and they may or may not be available. But even if they are available, it's very unlikely that they're available immediately. So the idea would be the UN had its own capability. They'd have to pay for it. It might cost $3 billion to start off with, and $1.5 billion to maintain annually. Seems like a lot of money, but then when we look at that the cost of war is estimated to be $15 trillion in last year, it's not cost at all. What we're really talking about is political will, and I think some of the things that Laura was talking about reflect on that too. So a Tobin tax may seem odd and bizarre, but it's one option, one way of accessing cash that would flow once the political will is there, and that's as she said, civil society's role is to get that political will moving. So one of the elements that we note now, and it's been commented on quite a bit lately, is that most conflicts in the world are civil conflicts. Now they're not really Russia versus U.S., but put that comment aside for the moment. So what a UNEPS could do, legitimized by a Security Council resolution, would be to get involved into to stop a conflict or to stop it early so that it doesn't develop into a major war. But you look at Syria, and what would have happened if there was a UNEPS available, a UN entity, not a US or a NATO or a P5 entity that is frightening to some states, but UNEPS would be seen as a neutral body, and could get in there and do the nonviolent things if they got in early enough to keep something from getting out of hand. And so what do we have in Syria now? Because we don't have that kind of early capability, is we've got involvement of the U.S., of Russia, of Turkey, and on, states surrounding. It becomes international. It could develop, who knows, to nuclear capability. I mean, maybe that's a wild one there, but then we look across over to Korea, and then we see we're actually talking about nuclear war. So the question is, what capability do we need, and would UNEPS fulfill some of those possibilities?
Okay. Am I hearing somebody else or just me?
Just you.
Just me. Okay. I want to thank you both. This is a big thinking. We're thinking about things that will be extremely difficult to accomplish, and that's why it's worth paying attention to it. I think if we work together on some of these projects, that's the only way we'll ever make any progress. But I want to give you all of the viewers an awareness that some of the conversations that we've had tonight have been a preview of the sort of discussions that I imagine will take place in our forum as we debate which of these proposals make the most sense. Not that any of them don't make sense, but we have to look at the selection of the proposals for public policy changes that have the most effectiveness that we think in reducing all of these global issues, global threats. And so there will be discussions of exactly this kind on the 30th and the 31st of May. And before that happens, I hope that all of you will think of your own notions of how we can save the world. You know, what can we do that will make really a big difference? And formulate your own proposals in 15 words or less. Go to our website, because there's a specific way of doing this so that I'll be able to see it and put it on our list. Write to me or communicate through the website. There is a discussion column there. People should be discussing exactly, give us some feedback on what you have heard tonight in these various conversations. And let's hear from you, and then we'll add your thoughts to the growing accumulation of proposals for the platform for survival. And in the long run, our goal is to come up with one sheet of paper with, many pages of it, but many copies of it, but one sheet of paper with 25 lines on it, each having only 15 words or less, each summarizing the proposal of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish with a footnote. And then we'll put your footnote someplace else on the web page so that you can, and the footnote can be 50 pages long if you want. If you want to elaborate your reasons for proposing and the logic behind your proposal, please do. And in the meantime, you can be discussing this and debating it on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Have a look at it, plan to come, check the website for information about location and time and price. I can tell you it'll be a 2-day conference. For ordinary registration, it'll be $100 for the 2 days. But if you're a student or unwaged, it'll be $40 for the 2 days. And so that's not very expensive. And I'm quite confident that many of you can come and we'll have a good conversation about how the package of things that we're proposing, a comprehensive list of innovations and public policy changes, will go very far toward preserving humankind on this planet. So watch it, and thank you for watching this. And thank all of you speakers. Hope to see you in May, if not before. Good night.